Katie Tubb from the Heritage Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us here at the
Thanks
Titans
for
and Nuclear
having me.
Headquarters.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, the tables are turned. I think the first time we met, you were interviewing me as part of just like a general survey of what you think was going right and wrong in the space, right?
Wow.
That was a long time ago. That was
time ago.
like 18 months. That was a long time ago. But no, it's so glad to have you here and hear your story.
That's great. Thanks for having me.
So, so tell me, how did you first get into this space? What drew your attention to the sector?
That's a great question, and I think it's probably fair to say I stumbled into it. And I was interested in energy and environment issues, and especially the federalism issues there and the governance issues involved.
Where did that come from? Why?
I think that's just a personal interest. Growing up, I was fascinated by American history and the Constitution, why it works or does it work, and just how unique of a model it is to have unity in some things and diversity in others, and how that is a strength and a challenge at the same time. And
I love that. So that's like core to our country issues.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
So when I say I stumbled into nuclear issues, it wasn't on my radar. And then as I started working at the Heritage Foundation and realizing, wow, all of these themes are playing out in the nuclear space when it comes to especially things like nuclear waste, but even energy and environment policy broadly, that it's this push and pull and sometimes tension and sometimes beautiful, innovative expressions of unity and diversity within all those playing pieces.
Yeah. Is the Heritage Foundation your first job, or where?
Yeah, I've been there
amazing.
Over 7 years now.
So, all right. So tell us, like, from year one when you get tossed into, what is Heritage Foundation? Is that a think tank? What is it?
Yeah, it's a think tank. We call it a full service think tank. So anything, our primary audience is Congress. So anything Congress is doing, we hope to have an expert who can engage on those issues. Yeah. So primarily Congress, but increasingly the administration, whoever's in office is part of our audience, and then also just the general public to explain wonky DC policy issues to a normal human being, 500, 600 miles away.
Yeah. And so you found the Heritage Foundation. I guess did your personal ideologies align with the Heritage Foundation?
Yeah.
And then you just applied and you're in?
So I started as an intern.
Okay, worked your way in. Yep.
I started at the bottom and kept on chipping away.
Yeah,
Thankfully,
awesome.
I had people who believed in me and were interested in mentoring me, and here I am 7 years later.
And then so first year, did you get to, you just thrown on any subject matter that they need you for, and then you eventually get to pick which ones you like, or how does it work?
Not quite. So so I studied history in school, thinking, hey, I'm going to be a teacher someday, and then thinking, wait, I should do something else first and then go back into education. So the Heritage Foundation presented itself to me, and I thought, all right, that sounds like a good something other that's still kind of in that history realm. So I applied for things like constitutional law and education, because those are things I was passionate about and obviously interested if I'm talking about federalism. And they interviewed me for energy and environment policy. And it was probably the worst interview anyone has ever given, in the sense that I said straight up, I don't know anything about energy and environment. I know where the light switch is, and I know you're supposed to recycle. But that's all I know. So I don't think you actually want me.
Oh my God.
And they said, no, we're willing to teach you if you're willing to research and write.
So they saw something in you, though, obviously. They must have thought, like, oh my God, she's brilliant, or like some characteristic they spotted in you that they knew that even if you didn't have subject matter expertise, you'd still be a good fit for them.
I guess so. I mean, I'm still there. They haven't fired me yet. So.
Okay.
But to answer your question a little more seriously, I mean, the lifeblood of a history major is to research and to write. And that's what's required for a policy job is I spend my day reading a lot of government reports and sifting through data, regulations. It's very lonely work in a sense that I spend so much time delving deeply into the weeds of issues and then figuring out how to compile that in a way that is meaningful and useful and understandable for people.
I get it. I get it now. That's awesome. When you first dove in and you got the fire hose of what energy and energy policy even is, do you remember what the first the first thing that you learned that challenged, I guess, what you had thought the world was like before you learned it?
That's a great question. Two things come to mind. The first project I ever worked on was reading the Blue Ribbon Commission's report on nuclear waste.
Ooh, I can't wait to dive into that one. Okay.
So I read the whole thing, and my boss had a few things he was looking for in particular, especially things related to cost. So that was the first thing I ever worked on, and it was just nothing. I had read nothing like that before in my life. It was never on my radar, only to realize that as a taxpayer, I was paying for this system.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing that comes to mind. The second was more gradual over the course of the internship, realizing how impactful energy and environment issues are. And I think, especially for those on the right end of the spectrum, it's not something they think about every single day. And I think for Americans in general, we don't think about, and I didn't think about, when I turn that light switch on, I fully expect the lights to turn on.
Yeah.
I have no idea where that electricity comes from. It comes from the wall, which is not true. There's so many layers and steps beyond that. And policy is an important part of that. It's not the whole sum of it, but it has a huge impact on just my everyday life.
Yeah.
And so when I finally started to see that, I thought, this is cool.
Yeah.
And then to start seeing the policy implications of, you can use energy and environment to condition people's choices or give them freedom.
Wow.
And I think when we give the maximum amount of freedom, that's where we start to see innovation.
Yeah.
So when I started seeing all those themes kind of come into play and the just day in and day out policy issues in DC, I thought, okay, I'm in.
That's so
This
cool.
is interesting.
Right, because it touches every part of life. So
It does.
super duper impactful.
Yeah.
So when you say give more freedom, do you mean that you can design markets in such a way that encourage innovation?
Yeah, I think, so we'll look at electricity markets. Texas, I think, is an outstanding example. And there's some unique features of Texas, being its own independent geographic unit for the grid, essentially, that I think helps them. But
So literally the physical infrastructure for electricity, the wires, the transmission, the power plants, that's all kind of separate, maybe with a couple connections here and there, but it's pretty much separate from the other big grids.
Right, to their great benefit, and also a unique piece of them. So it's in some ways hard to translate that to the rest of the United States or regions thereof. Nevertheless, that aside, they have maybe the freest electricity market in the country. It's, for the most part, fuel technology neutral. And I think what you get out of that is energy companies, tailoring their business to the needs of Texans. So if they want 100% renewable, I as a customer can shop from literally dozens of companies to get 100% renewable.
Wow.
I can't accept a lot of risk, I can build a portfolio working with companies to get to that. If I'm willing to take on more risk and, let them moderate my energy use and pay less in the end, they can do that. And I think that's beautiful because you get innovation on the customer side and on the energy company side.
And how is this managed? Is this done, I guess, virtually and financially? Because you can't really route 8 different wires to someone's house if they said, this month I want to be totally independent and this month I want to shop for that or this.
Yeah, it's all, there's still a grid operator because physics are what they are.
Right.
And the poles and wires are still monopoly. And I think that's also starting to be a debatable point. But the point is...
Yeah, if we want to go really free market, we should let people erect as many poles and wires as they want, right?
I don't know that I would go that far. I think pieces of the grid can be competitively bid for management. So that's where I see markets playing out in the poles and wires, the highway system, for lack of another word, for the electric grid.
Got it.
So I see some monopoly components to that, but I also see the benefit of market competition in that space. That said, how you get customers and companies to interact there's still the market operator to kind of keep the whole thing from exploding.
Yeah.
But you have a whole bunch of intermediaries who, can pool together renewable resources or can be the broker for, say, if you want a fixed price monthly flat rate, they can bundle that for you. So I think that's where the innovation bubbles up and is communicated between the two.
Cool. I want to ask, the function, or at least your role within the Heritage Foundation. So you do the research, you get up to speed on a subject. What happens then? Do you brief people individually? Do you write reports? What happens?
All of it.
Okay.
So yeah, we write a lot. We work with offices on the Hill. And that's also part of my research too, is to understand, okay, maybe this is a great idea, but how do you actually get it done? Or is there a champion on the Hill who would be interested in something like this? So yeah, we talk with, we'll really talk with Democrats, Republicans, anybody. On the flip side, we also brief them and try and educate them on, this is an issue that matters. And so here's why it matters, and here's what we think is good policy, or you're pursuing a path that we think is bad policy and has consequences that you don't intend. But then we also engage with industry and then just consumer groups, either on an education level or our own education.
Cool.
The whole spectrum.
And which particular areas have you done a deep dive into throughout your career that you feel particularly proud about?
Well, nuclear waste is something I've done obviously from day one, and I haven't stopped doing it. I am passionate about the nuclear industry, and that nuclear technology already has, but literally can change the world.
Yes.
Whether it's, from the power in our light bulbs to medicine to food safety, it's amazing. And
it's magical.
It kind of is. It feels like it. And it's even, I think, a very environmental way to produce electricity and all of those things. The footprint of a nuclear power plant is insane to me, that we produce so much electricity at such a small footprint that it does seem magical. Can this really be? But even for the rest of the world, to me, energy is so important to a productive, healthy life. And to be able to give that to the rest of the world would be incredible. And so I'm passionate about it from that end of the spectrum, but also passionate about it in the sense of, why haven't we been able to do that to the degree that I think we could? And I think a lot of that is policy. A lot of that is just education. People are naturally, because of history, afraid of nuclear energy and afraid of radiation. We use our senses to warn us of danger, and you can't do that with radiation. And so people just knee-jerk react to, we don't want any of that then. And so I like leaning into that and trying to break down some of those myths.
Historically, what's separated radiation from other hazards that are also invisible? For instance, like toxic chemicals that might end up in our food that we can't taste, but that, look, Monsanto just had to pay, $1 billion fine the other day, and they're spraying the stuff across half the country. How come there isn't that same adverse public reaction to those invisible threats?
Well, there's clearly some adverse.
Some. But how come it hasn't affected its market power?
Yeah.
Whereas nuclear's market power has been diminished?
That's a great question. I think some of it is just unfortunate timing with pop culture. The China syndrome was...
Referring to the movie that came out right before Three Mile Island.
Yeah. That timing is quite unfortunate, almost to the point of surely this was planned? It wasn't, but the ability, for better or worse, or just by accident, to associate nuclear with pop culture in unfortunate ways, I think, is a big piece of that. And then also just every little kid going through a history class learns about the nuclear bomb. And it's so easy to just associate that with a power plant. They're fundamentally different, But I think we don't take the time to do that extra step of education to understand.
And isn't it up to the industry? Like any good functioning industry, like supports marketing teams and efforts to brand themselves how they want to be seen in the public light. Like Nike invests a lot of money, so when you put on their shoes, you feel like I'm fast and powerful, and instead of I feel like there's sweatshops in Southeast Asia providing for my footwear.
Mm-hmm.
Like they put on a lot of work to create the narrative that they want. How come nuclear's been so unsuccessful in investing in this education that we want? Like the industry, how come the industry doesn't invest in this?
Mm-hmm. I think a couple of things. First, it's a whole lot easier to connect normal everyday people with a fancy running shoe, whereas the whole electricity sector in general has the education issue of people just don't think about where their power comes from. So I think that's part of it. Another part, I think the nuclear industry just has bought into assuaging people's fears without educating them.
You're right. I think you're right.
And so they emphasize we're safe. No, we're 10 times safer than the regulations require. Well, but do the regulations make sense? If we're regulating to the level of, the amount of radiation in a banana, that's a little bit ridiculous. But then it gets really, really hard to right-size regulation, because what comes out in the press is, we're dumbing down standards, or anything where it looks like we're scaling back, regardless of if it makes sense or not. It's translated into, that's scary, and my government doesn't protect me or something, and the nuclear industry is clearly out for just making money.
So I think you're 100% right on that point. Have you or your team, have you guys brainstormed a way out of this conundrum?
Yeah. So again, one of the first things, as I was coming on, Heritage was just finishing a viewing tour around the country of a documentary that we put together called Powering America. And it looked at the nuclear industry from start to finish. So from the mine all the way to the waste. And it talked with people who worked at plants, people who lived around plants, how they felt about it. So that the whole spectrum. And I think the beauty of that project was Heritage is not the nuclear industry. We're not funded by the nuclear industry. So we have this great middle space to play of, there's definitely times on the policy side of things where we have parted ways with the industry. And there's times where we've worked with them because we agree on good policy. So I think we have an intellectually honest position in that we're not lobbying for the industry, but we can say, look, educate yourself, and here's what you see, that nuclear is not as scary as you think it is. And in fact, if you talk to these people and if you go visit a plant, it notches that fear down many factors, and for good reason, because it's fact-based at that point rather than emotionally based. Yeah. So I think that was a great project. And actually, you can still watch it online.
Yeah, well, that's what we're going to do.
Powering America.
Right after this. That's super cool. Tell me about the Blue Ribbon Commission report, and what you thought. What is that, and what did you think about it?
Yeah, when I first read it, I was like, "Holy smokes, what is this?" Because I didn't have a grid for what I was reading.
Yeah.
As I said, that it's the first thing I worked on. As I've learned more, I read that and think they got some things right, and then some things they kind of missed the picture.
Pull it apart for me.
Yeah. So the things where I feel like they missed the mark is that we've been having this conversation over and over and over again, especially on the policy side. Consent-based siting, great idea, but the Nuclear Waste Policy Act is technically consent-based siting. So it's things like that where I feel like, okay, we're clearly missing some of the fundamental errors in the Nuclear Waste Policy Act.
Just to help us understand a little better, what is consent-based siting?
Right. Well, here's a great example. One place in the world where we're moving forward on nuclear waste is in Finland. And it's because they have consent-based siting, which means industry, which is a distinct difference. Industry has had to fund, site, and construct a nuclear waste repository. And the site they found, I'm going to mispronounce the name, Olkiluoto?
Olkiluoto, yeah, something like that, yeah.
The community there was initially adamantly opposed, but because they're working with a company rather than a government, there were years and years of education and negotiating to come to mutually beneficial terms. So it's not that this small community was up against a federal government in which they were clearly an unequal authority. They were working with a commercial business. And so they had ultimate power to come to terms of consent. And in the end, what originally had been a vote of the town council of like, I may get the numbers wrong, but it was essentially like 20 opposed and 2 in favor, totally flipped.
Wow.
And they said, please come on in and start building.
Yeah, cool.
So that's consent. What's different in the United States is that it's not the industry negotiating with, say, Nevada. It's the Department of Energy. And that's the way Congress has stipulated the law to be. And I think that's a fundamental error that makes me wonder if we will ever get there until we address that issue.
And how is this set up right now? So there's like an act of Congress or something that says this is the way that nuclear waste has to play out. And then in order to not be breaking the law, industry has to follow what Congress said instead of what might be easier and better for everybody.
Yeah, I mean, generally that's the issue. So the Nuclear Waste Policy Act was signed in 1982 and amended in 1987 to make Yucca Mountain in Nevada the national repository.
And what do we do with other chemical waste that I hate the argument, oh, nuclear waste lasts 1 million years, we have to protect our future societies for 2 reasons. One, like the ego, that we have better technology or solutions than humanity 100 years from now, given that 100 years prior, they were in horse and buggy still.
That's a great point.
Okay, so like that, we have a real ego problem when we say we need to protect people for over 100 years out. That's one issue that I have with it. But the other issue that it lasts millions of years, when you say, and that's just the issues with the millions of years comment, some waste lasts infinity long. Arsenic, cadmium. I mean, these are elements that will never change for as long as our planet is not reconsumed by the sun 10 billion years from now. That also have a level of toxicity and are used in industry, throughout industry, at quantities 1,000 or 10,000 or 1 million times as fold as what nuclear is. Why is nuclear waste something that gets a special designation for that Congress needs to get in the middle of and say what we need to do with it?
I think in part because we've made it a political problem, a political touch point that certain politicians have made their career off of looking like they're out for, they're looking like they're protecting health and safety. And the way you do that is
with fear.
Yep, with fear, and to say no, 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 and just shut things out. So I think that's part of it. Once you make something political, it becomes
a hot potato.
Yeah, it becomes, nobody wants to move forward because then they look like the one that clearly doesn't care about public health and safety.
Is there any way that we can capitalize on that, though? If we know that that is the problem and that it's potentially left us in this like quagmire that we can never get out of, can we use those same forces of psychology to resolve the issue? For instance, can we have someone who leverages the fact that people are being so ridiculous with it and uses their own brand as like, I'm the common sense guy to, and use this issue to vault themselves into a better political position by saying, listen, we're going to treat it like common sense instead of treating it like something special?
I would like to think you're right.
Sorry, I'm just dreaming.
No, I think it's a good question. I think we can get there if we pick apart the National Waste Policy Act and make the government. So I think one reason Finland works is you've got industry negotiating with a host community, and their federal government is essentially the referee. So any construction plans still have to be licensed and reviewed. The federal government is a referee in that situation rather than the customer. So true or not, in the United States, the government is the referee and the customer, at least visually, to, say, people in Nevada.
And who is going to, let's say, lobby to pick apart that Waste Act?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Because the way that I see it is that if you look at every other industry other than nuclear, they benefit from waste being an issue that is unresolvable. Like some directly because states will pass laws that say you can't build a new nuclear power plant here until the waste issue is resolved. And then other just benefit from this general sense that nuclear waste has this waste, that nuclear has this waste issue, and thus, let's just install some solar panels instead. So that's everything else except nuclear. And then as I look at the nuclear industry today, it's no longer, full of developers like Combustion Engineering, Babcock and Wilcox, the old Westinghouse, the old GE, that are building tons of plants and want to resolve the waste issue. It's now full of Holtex, the Westinghouse cleanup division, Orano, who all make billions of dollars from waste being an issue. So it's everyone in the world right now benefits from waste being an unresolvable issue. The markets, the incentives are set up so everyone benefits from it. And there's just no industry left that can lobby to say, listen, waste is just not an issue.
I'm with you halfway.
Okay, yeah.
So,
pick apart my flaws.
I think you're right. Under the current situation, there's very little incentive to do anything. Politicians don't gain anything by going out on a limb.
Yeah.
Nuclear power operators, so the facilities, they don't really have incentive to do anything because they simply sue the government for not collecting waste as they were contractually obligated to do. So any financial loss they have in storing waste on site
is neutralized.
They're made whole again by the taxpayer.
Yeah, crazy.
And so I think the biggest incentive, or the party with the biggest incentive, is the taxpayer because they're being fleeced.
That's a really good point. I hadn't thought of that party, the taxpayer themselves.
Yeah, but the trouble is most taxpayers don't know that they have paid out about $7.5 billion in the last 10 years just to store nuclear waste on site, whether they get their power from a nuclear power plant or not. And it's simply because of our legal structure that there is no incentive to move forward. So until we have a repository, the nuclear power companies will successfully sue the federal government, and the federal government will successfully dish back the money, and we'll just sustain this until somebody gets mad enough.
Yeah.
And I think, Congressman Shimkus is an example of somebody who's fed up with this system, and he's trying to push legislation that will force Yucca Mountain.
Who's Congressman Shimkus?
He's from the state of Illinois.
Cool.
Illinois and Pennsylvania are the two states with the most nuclear power plants in their state. And so waste is clearly an issue for them. California is another example of a constituent body that's very motivated to get waste off of their power plant sites. So I think there's different motivations there, but Shimkus has tried to make it his issue to solve this problem. Obviously from his own personal interest with the state of Illinois, but I think also from the taxpayer's perspective of this is not sustainable.
Yeah.
This is not a solution. So yeah, I think you have to bust up the Nuclear Waste Policy Act and get to those root problems.
Awesome.
Where I think I disagreed with you is that there's Holtec is a good example. Deep isolation is another. But I think there's companies out there that want to bring innovation into nuclear waste. There's just very little incentive to do it with it all locked up in the federal government. So I think it's there, and I think it could be there. if we make industry responsible for those decisions, then I think you get innovation.
Maybe, but I'll push back on this, because given that it's the federal, or say it's the taxpayer who is paying for all this, or the ratepayer in some situations for the electric utility, companies like Holtec or Deep Isolation, their market size is governed by how much money the taxpayer puts into this. So they are incentivized to increase the regulations around radiation, to increase the special technology that must be used and must be deployed, to make it a $100 billion problem instead of a $7 billion problem. That's behind the scenes. If I was running those companies, that's what I would be doing. I would be spreading the message of fear to increase my market size. So, I'm glad you brought up the point about the ratepayer and the taxpayer, because I'd forgotten about them. Right? At the end of the day, as citizens of this country, it is our responsibility to step up and make our voices heard for issues where, like you said, we're being fleeced.
Yeah. Yep.
Looking forward to the future. We always like to wrap this up with an optimistic note. So tell me, 10 years out, everything goes right. You put on your magic wand and you get to make whatever happen. What does the world look like?
The way I want it to look like, or where I think it will look like?
What's the way you want it to look like? And I'm going to give you Queen of the Universe powers to actually make it happen.
Great. Excellent. Congress has the courage to take a hard look at the Nuclear Waste Policy Act. They realize what's working in Finland and why it's not working in the United States. They take the entire nuclear waste fund, which power plants have paid into for years for Yucca Mountain. They give it all back to the industry. Industry is now responsible for managing nuclear waste. They go to Nevada and they say, we've got a deal for you. We'll give you $1 billion a year if you take our nuclear waste. And Nevada, who would pass up $1 billion a year? You can turn that into essentially an endowment and, have $1 billion a year potentially in perpetuity. That's what I would love to see happen in 10 years.
Katie Tubb, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks very much for having me.
Awesome.